WNST. It's House Pastor Marty Conway from Georgetown, and of course, longtime Orioles front office member in charge of selling Oriole baseball and enthusiasm around baseball. It is always good to have you on. You can find him out on LinkedIn. You can find him on Twitter. You can find him at a university and talking about sports, business, and marketing. Marty, the World Series is here, and, it was 40 degrees in Boston, and had a chance to go up to Boston and maybe go to a game with my wife, and we just thought the better of running off to Boston and sitting outside on a 40-degree night and watching baseball. So instead, we stayed at home and watched 40-degree baseball, and I don't know, man, the pace of play and where we are, and old guys like you and I will debate this, but first off, good to have you aboard. How are you feeling about the World Series? Because this is sort of a wet dream for baseball, right? Red Sox, Dodgers,
yeah.
It never happened. If this isn't as good as it gets, Dodger Stadium and Fenway Park, and Manny Machado is the bad guy, I don't know how it could get much better than this on a national basis, right?
No, you're right about that. That to get in a couple areas, number one, to get what baseball and their TV partners crave, is, large markets. So you get Boston and you get Los Angeles, and then as a result, you get people that either love or hate those two markets and their teams. So you sort of get that drawn in. And then clearly on each team, you have recognizable names, whether they be pitchers or position players, and then you even bring some villainous events like Manny Machado. So from that standpoint, it should not be hard to draw an audience, sustain an audience, and keep this going. And then the last thing that they would hope for is a series which would go 6 or presumably 7 games and stretch this out over 10 or 11 days. So that combination certainly seems set for them, although as you're starting to see, it's playing out differently than they would have liked it to play out, and including in person and on television.
The game's changed so much, man, and I don't even know where to begin with this, but let's just start with 4-hour games and relief pitching and pace of play. And Jeff Passan wrote a piece. I referred you to it. I woke up to it on a Wednesday morning after Game 1 about how bad it is. And my wife fell asleep on Game 1, and she's been a Red Sox fan, and I cried, 14 years ago, and on the phone with her family about how incredible it was. I don't know that her families even want. I mean, I don't even feel it on Facebook or on Twitter, and I have a lot of friends that are from that part of the world, and I have friends out in L.A. I don't know, Marty. I mean, the ball gets hit right at people. All of these pitching changes. I don't think it's very good right now as a product, and it certainly isn't capturing me, and I am the audience. I don't know how it's going to capture new people. I really don't.
Well, the few things that I would add to that, number one, I think you're right. I think generally sense that this is the direction that it's going in, and then we can talk about whether that's good or bad mostly. But we do know that, for example, that in the postseason, and this is unique to baseball for the most part, the game just slows down in the postseason more so than just about any other sport. And a lot of that has to do with the nature of how postseason baseball is played, more pitching changes, more relief pitchers, double switches in the National League, all sorts of things, because the amount of data that is available to both teams, and Jeff Passan touched on this in his fine article, which is that the amount of data to both teams, because they've studied each other for so long, and now they have the opportunity to play each other, that there's reams of data on each player, each situation, each time of the game when this could occur, and all sorts of things. So the second thing is you're able to change the roster so significantly compared to other sports in the postseason. And you can change your roster from series to series. You're allowed to add, more starting pitchers. Relief pitchers. You get down to the point where the team that wins, in some respects, is almost unrecognizable, with the exception of the 9 starting players on the field. And that's a real difference. So those are the sort of things, I think, that in addition to how the game is played, shifting and all sorts of things, that frankly baseball, and when I say baseball, I mean Rob Manfred, they really have to do a deep dive on here as to what do they want to deliver to their ultimate audience. And then number 2, as you said, how do they expect to attract any new audience, anybody under the age of 34, for example. Why would you tune in? Why would you get involved? And so I think that leads to where we would talk about next, and that doesn't matter whether the game is in Baltimore, Washington, or Los Angeles, or Boston. That is, how do they stay ahead of the game from a marketing and business development standpoint? And right now they're chasing the game, right? The game is being changed in front of them, and it almost seems like, they're the Texas State Legislature. They only meet every 2 years, and they end up having to do a lot of things in 2 years because they're not changing, something every year to stay ahead of it.
Marty Conway is here. You can find him on LinkedIn. He doesn't blog often enough, but when he does, I read. He's also out on Twitter and, of course, teaching the young folks at Georgetown University after being involved in Major League Baseball for a long, long time. Marty, your background in getting involved in the game, probably no different than mine in getting involved in media. I love sports. I loved baseball. It's all I've ever known. I mean, I've worked in a sports department at a newspaper when I was 15. I've been doing this since I was 23. I'm now 50. I'm worried for me because this is how I've fed my family and made a living, all these years, that when baseball's not even interesting or recognizable or fun for me, I really begin to worry. And when it's not fun to the people around me, I worry. You got a year or 2 or 3 on me, and I'm assuming you got into all this because you loved it. I'm assuming you look back on that as probably the greatest time in your life and fun times and working in baseball. And I know you went through big boy stuff with strikes and worked in the Major League Baseball office and stuff, but there's something on a Tuesday night at 8:07 when there's first pitch and the bunting's out that draws you to it. Maybe it's your friendship with Janet Marie Smith, who now runs the Dodgers, or your friendship with Charlie Steinberg, who used to run the Red Sox, or Larry Lucchino, who used to run the Red Sox, and they're sitting there and having a little bit of stock in all of this as well. But then the game starts, and you watch it, and you say, I don't know that I like this as much as I used to. And that's a little frightening for me with the last name of Aparicio, and I know baseball has sort of defined your life as well, has it not?
Yeah, it certainly has, and we're all drawn by the affinity. Fans are drawn by the affinity to a connection, whether it's to your parents that brought you up in that regard. So we know what that is. But what baseball has seemed to have lost their track here, which is, like I said, is I relate this to the issues that we had in sports in a big way with performance enhancing drugs. Right, the notion was that the athletes were ahead of the enforcers, that the chemists in the labs were ahead of the enforcers, right? And that's sort of what we have here, which is the game is being managed and developed differently at the general manager and manager, dugout manager level, but not so much to appeal to the broader audience, right? And so if you're involved in any way, at this point, in any substantial management of a major league team or Major League Baseball, et cetera, I think it's time that they grabbed the reins of the game and essentially said, these are the things that we have to change in order to draw more people in. And I'll give you several examples. Every spring, nearly every spring that I can remember for the last several, we've had a conversation, or there's been a national conversation about pace of play, and we read what Major League Baseball is going to do, right? At one point it was you weren't going to be able to step out of the batter's box, or you had to leave 1 foot in the batter's box. There was a clock between innings that we were going to go to. Now we have visits to the mound, and in minor league baseball they've been using a pitch clock for the last several years to try to keep things moving, of which the universal thing that happens is none of it ever gets enforced past about May 31st, right? And so as a result, every year we come back for the last several, we come back to the World Series time, and we're rehashing the same issues: the pace of play, the type of play, the amount of strikeouts, different things like that, which have been detrimental to the game. And so if you just establish those sorts of facts, and I look at college basketball as a great example of how they have managed the interest in the game, and that is when Four Corners and Dean Smith was taking over and ruining the end of games, they put in their shot clock. When Jim Valvano was hacking players in the last 2 minutes to try to get them to the line and endless 1-and-1s, they made a change. At 10 fouls, you shoot 2 free throws. Right? It was sort of a penalty in that respect. And so,
but there's no arbiter of what makes the game better, right? What makes the game better is more people watching on television and more people willing to pay for
right?
it. That lets you know your game's better, right?
But baseball has not done that, and it's remarkable because baseball has remained strong financially despite this, right? TV contracts are up, sponsorship agreements are up, player salaries are up, all those things trend up, but yet the core of the game itself has been struggling in the demographic and the change. And this is where I think that baseball officials, including the top officials at each club, have to step forward and say, we have to demand change because it's evident in every market that we're losing people under the age of 35, now under the age probably of 45, and they're not making the required changes to make the game more interesting. Marketing is a separate component, but not making the game interesting enough for people to come in and sample 2, 3, 4 innings, 5 innings in the most important time of the year, which is the postseason.
Marty Conway is our guest. He is out on LinkedIn sometimes and out on Twitter a lot of the time during the games, after the games, and, of course, longtime Major League Baseball executive with the Orioles. And anything you want to say on the Orioles before I get on to Saudi Arabia, because I know you do work in that part of the world and the WWE and this, we got to go from the toy department to the real world, as you know, down in Georgetown. But the Orioles and the deafening silence that's being heard and felt right now for anyone who's a fan of that brand.
Well, the point is, I think that if I understand the practical challenges of where they are right now, which is having to hire a complete new baseball side of the operation. But having said that, I don't think that stymies and actually ceases your business operation. And we're approaching the beginning of November as we talk. We can see it. It's in the the near future. And you can't buy a baseball ticket in this town, right? You can't commit to anything in particular. Maybe you could renew last year's ticket by putting some sort of deposit down, et cetera. But literally, there's a deafening silence on your ability to participate from a commercial and business standpoint with the brand. And I think we see this over and over again, which is you can't, in an environment where people are constantly transacting, you're getting Amazon packages every day, you're involved in commercial transactions, you're involved in electronic commerce, that you can't find the Orioles as a brand and be able to participate and purchase in something. Again, I just think it leads to what's happened over the years, which is the continual decline of the revenue base in various forms, whether it's in tickets, whether it's in luxury, all these sorts of things. And so seeding 2 or 3 months of the year, sometimes longer, to just a black hole, I think is just a recipe for this, consistent decline which they've faced. They've made some changes, they've brought some new people in, et cetera, but at this point, unless there's something that's planned in the next 2 weeks or by November 15th, it's again in the same mode, which is they must be waiting for somebody to bring the tablets down from the mountain to say, here's what we're going to do. I think it's the easiest thing, which is you're not going to have any price increases for next year, right? You didn't deserve it. There isn't anything reason for it. So why isn't your entire inventory on sale? You've announced your schedule at the beginning of September. Why can't I buy tickets to any game that I want anytime?
Well, then the question would be who would buy the tickets, and maybe they've asked themselves that. Marty, I would just ask you this, and I'm not being a jerk. And I know they employ people over there in all sorts of ways that people come and park their car and walk into the warehouse like Willy Wonka's factory, right? What are they doing? Like, they don't have anything to sell. There would be industry scuttlebutt if the number 3 guy with the Mariners was sneaking out of town to get permission to come interview to be the number 1 guy in Baltimore, whatever it would be. It just feels like there's no story there to tell anyone that I don't know, let alone they have a whole network, 2 networks on my television right now with nothing on it. They have websites and the Orioles.com with nothing on it. And I don't know how they go out and, it certainly would not be a good time right now to call and ask for 2019 money. But as you know, this is when all the marketing gets set. This is when all the real money is placed out there. I don't know how you go into a meeting right now. It's bizarre to me. All of it's bizarre to me.
Yeah, well, part of it that is, which is, philosophical, which is they prefer silence to anything else. It appears in terms of, and here's why that hurts them, because like you said, having network, having all these other outlets to do this, not having that overarching, baseball music, if you will, muzak in the background, makes it difficult to go out and have these conversations or launch these sorts of programs in the context of the Ravens in the middle of their season, et cetera. Now, I know that Major League Baseball dissuades and keeps people from making announcements during the World Series, and they prefer that things wait until the end, but there are off days, there are all sorts of times to get around that. But like I said, generally speaking, you can't go away. Now, whether that's community affairs events, I know Buck Showalter's having a run coming up on the weekend. There's some, disparate things that go on, but that's, like I said, that's where that hurts them, because then they're in a position where you're just losing days off the calendar that you could have commercial transactions and relationships. And again, maybe there's some behind the scenes conversations, et cetera, but the ability to work with and use the media opportunities to tease, interest, to tease stories, to tease conversations, it's just not something that they have a reflexive muscle for, and they have a clear disinterest in that. They would still like to do sort of the old Soviet Union practice, which is command and control will determine when and where we want information to go out and how we'll distribute it. And the media world is anything but that today. And it's a real gift to be able to work with that environment where you can, to some extent create the news environment out there. There are people who do that really well. They just seem to have no interest in that, and silence is the coin of the realm for the most part, which, again, we see it in the results. You see it in the business results that they have. And on the other hand, the Ravens are doing fine. People are happy in town. So as a result, it's hard to get those conversations started.
We've talked a lot about the Ravens this week. We are now talking about baseball and sports and marketing with our professor of sports business around here, Marty Conway, who ran the Orioles for a period of time, as well as Major League Baseball offices and the Texas Rangers, but now doing bigger picture stuff. And you spend a long period of your time each day with young people and young, thoughtful people and thought leaders down there at Georgetown in all sorts of ways. You've traveled the world. I've seen you on camels over in the Middle East with Qatar and them getting ready for a World Cup that was pretty, brazenly bribed and bought, and the Russian thing that just happened, and now, and I don't just mean the election, the Russian thing that happened 2 years ago, the other Russian things that have happened with the Olympics and the World Cup. Boy, this Saudi Arabia murdering Washington Post journalist out in the open, lying about it 7 different times, and finally on Thursday morning just admitting, what the hell, we plotted the whole thing, we cut his hands off, we chopped him up into little pieces, we snuck him out, we've lied about it, now what are you going to do about it? And the Vince McMahon stuff, bro, I mean, look, I don't watch wrestling anymore. I go back to Bobo Brazil and Bruno Sammartino and superstar Billy Graham back in the day, and I know of McMahon's ties to the Mango Man down in on Pennsylvania Avenue, and Linda being involved and all the money and all of that. But, boy, they're going to go over to Riyadh and put on a wrestling match? Are they really going to do this, Marty?
Well, as we speak, I think it's still likely to happen, although, they're starting to lose, John Cena, reportedly. I don't think it's anything they've made official.
Boy, that John Cena thing in the ring, praising the king, like, that's not going to play well for him forever. He's going to regret doing that, brother.
Yeah. So I think it's, in the balance. But I would say this, and that is, number one, generally, having been in the area enough times over the last 3 years to understand that saving face, if you will, use that as a phrase, is essential in that part of the world. It's similar to the way doing business in a culture like Japan. Finding ways to could just clearly save face in situations. So a pure pullout, I think, is unlikely from that regard. That is, you can ruin relationships forever, not just in Saudi Arabia, but throughout the Gulf region for doing sudden type of things like that. Everything really needs to be iterative over time and little steps that lead to something, whether that's getting money and doing a deal or walking away from it. So that's number one. Number two, I'm just not sure that WWE from a corporate perspective has a lot to lose in this regard. And that is to sort of give in to the momentum, which, is, it's fair criticism for sure. But to make that change, I don't think that as I study the audience, and we study it very carefully about WWE, it's such a solid audience, and it's been that way for decades now. And those people still continue to show up to the ring. They still buy the WWE network. They buy the merchandise. They follow all the athletes that are a part of it. They almost seem impervious, if you will, to public pressures of things like that. Their athletes are not unionized. They're not individualized. They're pretty much employees. And so I think they work with them if they have some sort of personal issues. But from a production standpoint, I could be wrong, but I would doubt that there'll be any substantial change to it because this has been in the works for a long time. And number two, that market, having been over there for events, they really need events like this. They pay a lot of money for it. They do a lot of organization around it. And the sports culture to them is significant. Now, again, having said all that, they could make a decision in the next 3 days to make a change, but I think the closer that it gets to the early November date, I think the less likely it is for it to change. And I think they're sort of hoping and praying to a certain extent that some of this becomes background over the next couple of weeks as the event gets closer.
So I should send them thoughts and prayers is what you're telling me on this. Look, I would say this about Saudi Arabia, and this is where I'll get on my political bent. They have enough money to buy whatever they want, right? Like, if you're for sale, they can buy you, whether you're an American bomb that they want to drop on children in Yemen, or whether you're someone that's going to bring someone like John Cena to stand in the ring and point up to the king and say that all is well here because women now can drive. So it's just cool here in Saudi Arabia. And they believe in the same things we believe in, which is money. And they paid me to be here, and here I am. And I think that's going to be a question for a lot of people in regard to this and how we transact business moving forward now that journalists are being killed and bombs are being sent off to journalists and politicians. I don't know that there's going to be any movement on this from the people in the red hats, which is primarily what the WWE wants anyway. And then there's the whole fiduciary part of this, right, Marty, which is if I own stock in this or it's business, I am obligated to take their money, even though they murder people. But, we all murder people. It's fine. Their money cashes, so we have to take their money in order to stay in business and feed the business machine over here in the Western world.
Well, yeah, and some additional to it, having transacted enough business and done some, including with Saudis and Qataris and all throughout there, there's much more to this than this event. We don't see it, and we probably aren't going to see it or maybe never see it, but there's a lot more to this than just the event itself, whether that's in investments in networks, other sorts of things. There's a massive television network called beIN Sports, which is run out of Qatar, which essentially in some respects, you might say, it's a combination of Sky Sports and ESPN throughout that Middle Eastern world. That relationship, even though it's a Qatari-based relationship, is essential. And so having, again, something staged in Saudi versus someplace else, it seems to me that it's probably a WWE platform for the Gulf region. And again, the Gulf region is going to become much more influential in sports. It already is, but it's going to become much more.
Well, that part of the world has gotten interested in sports all of a sudden, right? Like they sort of get it now, the glory and the disconnect that we get to win and we get to cheer, because that was something that just did not exist in that culture 50 years ago, right?
Yeah, and bringing the World Cup to that region is it's almost like when the World Cup, it might even be bigger than when the World Cup went to South Africa. But to bring it to that region, which has not had the ability, for a lot of reasons, stability, governments, facility, infrastructure, lots of reasons,
weather,
to be able to host, something of this sort. So it's already changing the nature of how sports looks at it, and just also keeping in mind that the average age population, the largest demographic in that part of the world, is below 35 years old. And so it's going to continue to explode. And again, we may disagree with how each country or collectively they do certain things, but I can tell you this from talking to them, and their understanding is as they move sort of towards us in that regard with sort of culture and different things. It's going to be at their pace. They are not. There's no third-party media. There's no other elements that can accelerate and push and sort of embarrass. They move things at their pace, and they also recognize. And then the last thing I would say is that the platforms of social media in that region are highly purposeful in terms of how any of all this changes. Some of the highest usage on Facebook and Instagram occur in that Gulf region. And so a lot of it has to do with them, especially younger people, seeing what's changing around the rest of the world and desiring that, and then coming up with their own formats and formulas for how to make those changes. But as a result, it takes 2, 3, 4 times longer to make change in culture, if it does change, than it does here, because there's not those institutions and NGOs that are pushing for the progress like you might see, in Western Europe or in North America.
Here's Marty Conway bringing us education and all that good stuff on sports and business and marketing, and certainly that part of the world, little political side as well. Oh, by the way, you can go hear Johnny O and Al Rebmer out of the BuyAToyota.com audio vault if you like civic issues around here. Marty, always a pleasure, man. The Ravens obviously with a kicker missing a field goal here, but it's been a good NFL season for the NFL so far. We haven't pointed that out, and I only bring you on about once a month, and I know I'll bring you back Thanksgiving time, and there'll be a whole different conversation going on, but so far so good for football in America, right?
Yeah, well, scoring is up, right? You see a lot more in terms of touchdowns up and down the field, et cetera, so that parlays. I think the NFL you have to give them credit for as much criticism as we've talked about and other people talked about for 2 years. They have turned the dial down on certain things that prompted issues, whether it was political issues or commercial issues or other sorts of things. They sort of dialed that back. The other thing they've done is they've put an emphasis on the star players, on the quarterbacks, on wide receivers, because they understand that unless those people are in the game, all of that coagulates to one thing, which is television, right? And so the ratings have sort of stabilized. They're not going to be what they were because cord cutters and all sorts of things like that have occurred. And so from a standpoint of getting through a season and having little to no kind of distractions, early on they had some issues with rules, but again, they've sort of worked that out. I think they're headed for probably their best season in the last 5 years. From a commercial standpoint, they've dialed back some of the other criticisms on paid patriotism and other kinds of things that were out there. And so you got to give them credit. I think you got to give the Ravens credit for bouncing back, and we haven't heard any issues with stadiums and seats and tickets and different things that were sort of an issue early on. And so as predicted, people got accustomed to how you get in and out of the stadium, how you get your tickets, whether they're hard tickets, whether they're on your phone, et cetera. People make adjustments, and you move forward.
Marty, always a pleasure, man. Keep enjoying the baseball. So you got a rooting interest, Red Sox or Dodgers, or no?
My only rooting interest, quite frankly, is I would like to see 7 games. I would love to see. I'm much more, when I watch a game, I like to see that center field camera shot, and I love Fenway Park from that standpoint. People standing, they've got hats on, there's no ties, all that. And now we're going to shift to L.A., where when you see that home camera shot, you see a lot of empty seats behind home plate. People are chatting, looking at their phone, not really paying attention, but they do support it pretty well. I would just love to see a Game 7 back in Fenway Park, a week or so from now.
All right, you get 2 tickets. We'll go up there and freeze together for Game 7, all right?
Okay, great.
I'll buy the beer. You buy the hot chocolate, all right?
Gotcha.
There he goes, Marty Conway. Find him out on LinkedIn. Find him on Twitter. Find him at Georgetown University, where he's doing all things sports professoring on the side of business and marketing and the real world. Always a pleasure to have his insights. You can find me out on the BuyAToyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn Radio app. We do come in crystal clear from anywhere in the world. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.